we are unveiling a new CNN poll from Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. David Chalian is where else at the Magic Wall to break it all down. David?
3 polls for you today, Dana. Yes, these are our final set of battleground state polls, and today we're focusing on those blue wall states. Take a look at the overall numbers among likely voters in Pennsylvania. Dead heat tie, 48% to 48% in the biggest Electoral College vote prize of the battleground map. In Michigan, slight edge for Kamala Harris, 48% to 43%. In Wisconsin, we also see a slight edge for Harris, 51% to 45%. I will note in these 2 states, the Supreme Court ruled that it's going to stay this way. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. remains on the ballot, and his presence there may be putting some downward pressure on Trump's numbers there. Let's look at the gender gap across all 3 states. You see here, I'll start down here in Wisconsin. Trump is up 12 with men, Harris up 21 points with women in our poll. That's certainly helping her there. The gender gap's helping her in Michigan. Men are tied between the 2 candidates in Michigan in our poll, whereas Harris has an 8-point advantage with female voters in Michigan. But then take a look here. There isn't really much of a wide gender gap. Trump's got a 4-point edge with men in Pennsylvania. Harris has a 3-point edge with women. That certainly helps explain why the race is tied there. African-American voters. Now, I just want to say, here we're comparing likely voters in a poll, which is different than actual voters that show up in the 2020 exit poll about how the electorate sort of shaped itself and how they voted in Pennsylvania. But as a comparative point, in our poll among likely voters in Michigan, Harris has a 71-point advantage among African-American voters over Donald Trump. Joe Biden in Michigan 4 years ago, according to the exit polls, won the African-American vote in Michigan by 85 percentage points. So a little bit underperformance there in this poll, but much more dramatically in Pennsylvania. Harris's lead with African-Americans among likely African-American voters in Pennsylvania in our poll is 55 percentage points over Trump. Biden in 2020 in the exit polls won African-American voters in Pennsylvania by 85 percentage points. That is a potential warning sign in places like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, for the Harris campaign to take a look at. And then interestingly, this is Donald Trump's base, Dan, as you know, white, non-college educated voters. And it is still his base, but he's not performing as strong as he did 4 years ago. If you compare now, in Pennsylvania, has a 27-point advantage with white non-college voters in our poll among likely voters. But back in the exit polls 4 years ago, he actually won them in Pennsylvania by 32 points. You see it in Michigan, 17. Back then it was 21 points. In Wisconsin, in the poll, he has an 11-point edge among white non-college likely voters. But in the 2020 exit polls, he won them by 16 percentage points. So a little bit underperforming with his own base now.
So interesting. And what about what voters are saying regarding Harris and Trump and which candidate they think gets them?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. I know there are a lot of numbers here because we tested a whole bunch of candidate qualities. But clearly Harris's best mark across all 3 of these battleground states is that voters see her far more as honest and trustworthy than they do Donald Trump. But I would look at these next 2 categories. Cares about people like you, puts country ahead of self. I think these 2 categories were the point of her closing argument speech last night on the ellipse. And those categories are working for her. Obviously, she'd like to see them be even bigger advantages across these 3 states. Shares your vision for the country. In Michigan, she's got a 1-point advantage. In Wisconsin, a 4-point advantage. Trump actually has the advantage on that category in Pennsylvania. And this is Trump's big advantage right now as a characteristic. Bring change the country needs. He has an edge against Harris among likely voters in all 3 of these states, obviously much closer in Michigan and Wisconsin. It's a pretty significant 7-point advantage in Pennsylvania. Harris clearly wants to do some work on this score as well. Who's left in the electorate? Well, not very many people. Most people you see here in the mid-90s, low 90s, mind made up. You see what a small percentage are still movable voters. And what about those that already voted? Now, we asked people, so among likely voters in our polls in all 3 states that tell us they've already voted, Harris is actually winning the people who tell us they've already voted in all 3 states. I would just say it's about a quarter in Pennsylvania and a third in Michigan and Wisconsin. Not as big a share as we saw in our poll yesterday in Arizona and Nevada, where they have a bigger tradition and a longer tradition of participating prior to Election Day.
A lot to digest there. Thank you so much, David. We'll see you in approximately 5 seconds, digging into All of this, in addition to David, is Bloomberg and CNN's Nia Malika Henderson, Politico's Meredith McGraw. David is coming to the table. He'll be here momentarily. Nia, what's your takeaway from these?
You know, listen, the only poll that matters is the one on election day. But
I've heard that somewhere.
I just coined it just now. Listen, we'll see what happens. You could tell the work that Kamala Harris needed to do last night, arguing that she's the candidate for change, arguing that she would